So, thank you so much again, everyone, for being with us today. Thank you to those who are introducing yourselves in the chat. Please do feel free to continue doing that. Let us know who you are, where you're calling from today, if you like. And we have a nice chunk of time together today, almost 2 hours, because we really want this to be a useful session for you. We're going to share some exciting work that we've been doing that we see as a collective offering to our ecosystem, working at the nexus of gender justice, climate justice, and economic justice. And then we have a really wonderful panel discussion with some friends and colleagues who are going to help us think through how we use this information, how we as individual activists and as members of organizations and networks are navigating the current moment that we're in. And then we also have a really decent chunk of time for a collective moment to hear from you. We have a Padlet so that if you'd rather write your reflections rather than speak, you'll have the opportunity to do that. So whether you can stay the whole time or not, we're so happy to have you. And we're really looking forward to the discussion. But maybe before we start, a little bit more framing about what the Critical Trends Report is. So we, as we do, along with many of our friends and colleagues in the movement, have been working on the Trends Report for 3 years now. We're very lucky to work with Arimbi Wahono from Shared Planet, which is a really wonderful consultancy firm that works primarily with NGOs and with values-aligned organizations. And for the past 3 years, Arimbi has been the lead author of the report, doing an incredible amount of research, editing, working together with me and with others to produce what we hope is kind of a feminist tool, a guidebook, something that helps us understand and navigate with, with statistics and data, our advocacy for systems change in this challenging moment that we're in. So the report has 7 sections, which are aligned to the 7 key demands of the feminist action nexus for economic and climate justice and the blueprint that was written by Diana Yahaya and produced in 2021 to kind of outline what those demands are. And these will be familiar to many of you, whether you work on one of them or all of them. They're also very much echoed by the global feminist convening that was hosted by MENAFem Movement and We Do, and many of our friends here on this call last May, which resulted in the Rabat Declaration, which was an amazing co-created, co-drafted, almost kind of manifesto by several economic justice and human rights and feminist groups from the MENA region, and that we then put out as a sign-on statement. And we're grateful to many of you for signing on. So the purpose of this meeting is to also think about the Trends Report in the broader context of collective movement organizing, the demands that we can agree upon that each of us is trying to push forward from various perspectives and using various tactics. So the reason we look at these sort of 7 issues, systems change, debt justice, trade justice, the Bretton Woods institutions and their role in global economic governance, tax justice, climate finance, and then increasing corporate capture is because the analysis that we are so privileged to learn from, led primarily by structural feminists from the global South, teaches us that these are interconnected facets of the same problem, that the patriarchal, capitalist, colonial, white supremacist, heteronormative, etc., global economy and social system that surrounds it is at the root of so many of the problems that we are trying to address in our work and in our lives. So that's the sort of framing. And what I'm going to do now, I think, is pass to our amazing colleague, Arimbi, who, as I mentioned, is the lead writer and researcher of the report, to walk us through what's in there this year, what the updates are. Spoiler alert, like most of them are negative. And then we're going to spend some time together talking about, as I said, what we do with it, how we can take this information and collectively use it. So thank you again for being here. And I'm going to turn over to Arimbi to walk us through the report. Thanks, Arimbi.
Hello, thank you so much, Katie. I'm so excited to be here. It's the third year of doing this, and I'm also really happy to see some familiar names and faces and also new ones. So thank you for being here. As Katie mentioned, I represent Shared Planet, a social and environmental justice research consultancy where I lead our just transition practice area, where we kind of focus on addressing the structural drivers of economic and ecological injustice. And just before I jump into the work, of course, I want to acknowledge how it's come together collectively, how it wouldn't be what it is if it weren't for the contributions of some very smart and passionate feminists that I am very happy to be learning from. So thank you so much, everyone, for contributing to that. And with that, I would like to set the scene a bit for the presentation ahead on the next slide. Thank you, Katie. So 2025 was a year of many milestones. That's kind of how we wanted to open up the report to say that it's been 80 years since the UN formed, 30 years since the establishment of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action for Gender Equality, and 10 years since the adoption of both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. But what we see overwhelmingly is that governments are failing to fulfill their mandates under those platforms. And not just that it's a lack of progress, but even a total reversal of a lot of these governments' commitments to rights and development finance, including for gender. And as we sum up at the bottom of this slide, we know that this is happening because governments are driving, enabling, or subjugated by a patriarchal, imperialist, and capitalist world economy. So on the next slide, I will wait for the, okay, perfect. Thank you, Katie. So as Katie's introduced, the report covers 7 themes, but for today's presentation, we wanted to highlight 4 key messages that actually cut across each of those themes. Because after 3 years of doing this report, I think one of my favorite things about the work is the fact that we can kind of step back and connect the dots between those 7 thematic areas, because as Katie mentioned, they're so evidently interconnected. So I want to introduce those key messages briefly, and then we'll elaborate on each one in turn over the next few slides. So the first message is something we've all seen so clearly in 2025. Oh, sorry, Katie, could we go back to the previous slide? I'm just going to go through them quickly and then, okay, thank you. That the US has rejected multilateralism outright. And we know that a neoliberal multilateral order has never actually been rules or partnership based, especially for the global South. But this kind of mask off moment does represent a kind of new unraveling and outright rejection of the post-war liberal multilateral order that has centered on American hegemony for so long. And then these next 3 messages aren't really new by any means, but we want to recognize that they're increasingly devastating for women and girls, for gender justice, for structural justice at a time of growing hostility to rights and people's movements everywhere under an accelerating ecological crisis, and especially because of the refusal of those responsible to actually challenge the structural underlying drivers of injustice. So message 2 is about continued shortfalls in public and grant-based financing for climate, development, and gender justice, despite clear mandates. Message 3 is, as feminists have said time and again, there's just no excuses for these shortfalls in financing because we see that governments either don't have the right priorities, they're prioritizing things like capital or militarization, or the global north is driving forms of structural exploitation that bleed global south governments dry of, the money that they need and could have for development and gender justice. And finally, in terms of our fourth message, we know that governments actually haven't been able to ignore these macroeconomic crises, these financing shortfalls, but rather than putting forward the kinds of solutions that are simple and possible, i.e., regulation, public finance, they propose a whole kind of variety of false solutions that are rooted in voluntary action or profit-oriented investment, because that's just so much easier than taking accountability for dispossession. Okay, so on to the first message that we want to elaborate on. Thank you, Katie. So, what do we actually see in terms of this unraveling of the multilateral order? Of course, it would surprise no one to see that most of our examples on this slide are from the US, as we show across multiple chapters. So that includes in the beginning of 2025, of course, Trump's total dismantling of USAID, the tariff wars, their wholesale rejection of multilateralism, including, as we know, by rejecting South Africa from participating in the G20 for their presidency this year. The US's resolution late last year under the UN Security Council to pass a very blatantly colonialist peace plan for Gaza amidst the ongoing genocide in Palestine. But I think what's especially interesting here is how deeply and very unapologetically political a lot of the actions are. Because under neoliberalism, we've often seen how the US, their allies, northern-led institutions, exercise power against the global South while dressing it up in kind of technical language about market efficiency or fiscal discipline. But now, what we're seeing, for example, with the tariff wars, is the US very explicitly pushing a political anti-climate agenda. So, for example, threatening tariffs against countries that support an emissions levy on shipping under the International Maritime Organization. They've also threatened tariffs against countries like Malaysia and Cambodia, if those countries attempt to pursue economic agreements with China. And then, as we highlight here under Bretton Woods, the US has also pressured the IMF to provide a massive $20 billion loan that even the IMF was uncertain about issuing, despite their support for the current neoliberal government. And this loan was specifically to bolster the election prospects of right-wing President Javier Milei. But while the US is the primary culprit here, we want to, of course, emphasize that it's not the only one. Militarization is on the rise globally, with military expenditure having risen for the 10th consecutive year by 2024. And in 2025, Global North Military Alliance NATO had ordered its members to more than double their military spending by 2035. And as we also know, this does not bode well for the Global South, where NATO operations have supported imperialist wars in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. But if Global North countries actually cared about saving this partnership and rules-based multilateral order, we would argue that they could put their money where their mouth is, because after all, these are the world's richest countries that have benefited from colonial exploitation and neoliberal dispossession for hundreds of years. But what do we actually see instead? So on the next slide, we highlight a few figures about how global North countries are constantly abandoning their commitments when it comes to providing public and grant-based finance for climate, development, and gender justice, despite clear mandates for doing so. So here in this figure, we show how member state financing for the UN has fallen to levels that were last seen 10 years ago, just shortly after the adoption of both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And on the next slide, we can see a selection of a few. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Katie. Of a few global North countries that have been reducing their provision of development finance, or ODA, to the global South. And in 2024, total ODA actually fell for the first time in 6 years and has been projected to fall only much further. So I'm calling in from Vancouver, Canada. So as a Canadian, I want to briefly recall Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, sorry. Because it made a lot of waves. A lot of people praised him for calling out the rupture of the fictitious rules-based order, urging countries to build new partnerships in the wake of the US's rejection of multilateralism. And this does lead me to my next point. If Carney really believed this, why is his government, as highlighted here, and many others in the global north, only following suit in cutting off a critical source of finance for the global south? And in that same speech, Carney was very proudly talking about how Canada, under his leadership, cut taxes, fast-tracked investments in extractive industries, and doubled defense spending. So, leading me to my next point on the next slide. There is no reason for these financing shortfalls to exist. It is just simply that governments under neoliberalism don't have the right priorities because they benefit from extracting from the global south. And here we see a few of those priorities by the numbers in terms of how they're rooted in structural forms of exploitation. So, first of all, in the interest of military might over developmental justice, we can see that countries spent over 15 times more on military expenditure than on development finance that was projected for 2025, showing how far they'll go to protect capital. They've supported billionaires to grow their wealth by over 11 times more than they've provided in development finance. And as we know, a lot of countries say that there's not enough money for public climate finance, yet they've spent nearly $1 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies alone in 2024, while spending very much less on not meeting their climate finance obligations. But then on the other side, we also want to highlight how global South countries themselves don't have the fiscal space to finance development and gender justice because of global injustices and things like tax and debt. So, as we highlight here, US multinational corporations have driven hundreds of billions of dollars in tax abuse over the years. And of course, this directly takes away from building the kinds of public services that we need for gender justice or for mitigating and adapting to climate change. And because the Global South is punished by an unjust and neo-colonial debt regime, in 2024, what they spent on interest payments from external debt alone was over 5 times more than what they received in development finance. And it bears repeating here that the global north has been obstructing solutions to resolve the kind of cyclical debt crises that we see in the global south. So the blame for that kind of financial injustice does very much lie at their door. So on to the next message here. So as we've laid out in resources like the Robot Roadmap, as Katie's mentioned, and the Feminist Blueprint for Economic Justice, it's really clear what kinds of regulations and financing we need to advance feminist economic and climate justice. But what we see is that global north countries actually obstruct a lot of these actions. And at the same time, they're promoting either false or insufficient solutions to act like they're actually leaders rather than blockers of the kinds of solutions that we need. So on this slide, we give a few examples of those false or insufficient solutions on the left and what feminists believe is actually needed on the right. So under taxation, for example, the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, led by France, Barbados, and Kenya, has been promoting taxation as a way to raise climate finance for developing countries. So that's, of course, actually a great solution. Except that so far they're putting a lot of emphasis on targeting premium flyers, like private jet users. And France's climate ambassador has actually publicly stated at one of the task force's events that they're unlikely to promote taxes against the fossil fuel industry. But as we highlight here on the right-hand side, taxing the wealth of the richest and the profits of fossil fuel companies is the clearest way to both phase out some of the most significant drivers of climate change while also raising the revenue that we need for climate finance. And as feminists, we also want to highlight that these kind of small voluntary coalitions are not a substitute for action under multilateral spaces where all governments are negotiating for binding actions or mandates, such as under the UN Tax Convention. And then on debt, on the next row there, we've seen how Spain has led on promoting a new initiative called the Sevilla Forum on Debt. So they call this a kind of dialogue hub that's going to promote principles on responsible borrowing and lending, developing innovative solutions for debt resolution. But what we want to put a fine point on is that it's very clear that the Global South doesn't need new innovative tools. They need debt cancellation, in particular because of the very colonial and unjust terms under which a lot of that debt has accumulated in the first place. And we also want to see a multilateral workout mechanism for sovereign debt, which global North countries opposed during the negotiations for the fourth Financing for Development Conference in 2025. Finally, under climate finance, we've seen a huge proliferation of kind of private finance first approaches to climate mitigation and adaptation. And what we see is that a lot of these are prioritizing profit because they promise returns to private creditors first. So that's what we've seen, for instance, under the Tropical Forest Financing Facility launched by Brazil at COP30. Or we see that they're primarily kind of loan-based initiatives, like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that a lot of global North countries have formed with countries across Asia and Africa, meaning that they're only going to increase debt burdens. And on the right-hand side here, we highlight how under Articles 2 and 9 of the Paris Agreement, civil society has argued a very kind of clear resolution to this, divesting from extractive industries that aren't consistent with climate resilient development, and also dramatically scaling up public grant-based climate finance from developed to developing countries. So that's kind of the end of the four key messages, but we just wanted to also highlight a few of what we see as the positive things to highlight going forward. Because a lot of feminist and people's movements are driving forward solutions that are rooted in the economic sovereignty of the Global South, and in a lot of these multilateral arenas, we're seeing lots of progress. So some big wins here that we highlight include the UN's work on developing indicators to move beyond GDP as the primary measure of progress. There's also the outcome of the fourth Financing for Development conference, which called for a kind of platform to strengthen coordination amongst borrowing countries. So that's one step towards countering the punitive kind of creditor-dominated debt architecture. And of course, we've seen a lot of momentum under the UN Tax Convention, hopefully to advance fair allocation of taxing rights and also support a mandate for polluter pays taxes. Um, Finally, at COP30, civil society has been campaigning for a just transition mechanism and a gender action plan to push countries to support people-centered climate action, and both of these things were won. So the just transition mechanism in particular will be really important for ensuring that countries and people get the resources they need to fund the just transition. Um, and actually, we highlight here as well reforming the UN Security Council, abolishing the veto of the permanent members, and expanding the Global South membership. And although there's not lots of progress on that, like with some of the other areas here, it's a really crucial and systemic solution that we wanted to highlight as well. So for our next report, we're going to be keeping an eye on a lot of those developments. And I think it serves as a really important reminder of what we can do with multilateralism, despite shrinking civic space. So those were primarily global multilateral solutions. And on this slide here, we wanted to look at some of the solutions that actually come from countries in the Global South. So first of all, we want to see an agenda that's rooted in sovereignty, self-sufficiency, autonomy from the Global South. And so we frame all of that around the concept of kind of delinking from global capitalist dynamics, because we know that under these kinds of dynamics, the Global South can never actually develop because they only serve as a source of cheap land, labor, and resources for the Global North. And so these are a few for the ways that we see that delinking agenda actually coming to life. First of all, efforts to establish alternative credit rating agencies, because the big three US agencies currently punish the Global South by issuing junk credit ratings through these kind of unfair, politically motivated risk evaluations that make it a lot more expensive for those countries to borrow. And so recognizing that the African Union, as we highlighted in the report, has worked to establish an African credit rating agency that's going to be operational this year. And then second, we also note that it's quite interesting that Global South countries have been increasingly trading with each other, especially as countries like the US have been growing much more punitive and retaliatory with their tariffs and trade deals. So in 2025, South-South trade actually represented a third of global trade, and it's been expanding a lot faster than North-South or North-North exchanges. And for example, large countries like Brazil and India have also established trade partnerships in direct response to the US tariffs. Industrial policy is going to also be increasingly important for the Global South because it's going to be needed to diversify industries and detach from low value-added trade with the Global North. But of course, we recognize that this will remain difficult because institutions like the WTO can still punish the Global South for using industrial policy, even though we see that Global North countries use it quite freely and actually increasingly, as we highlight in the report. And if we could just go to the last slide, please, Katie. Perfect. So I'm not really going to cover all the content that's on this slide, except to say that our report does also highlight what we call local sites of struggle outside of multilateral advocacy and national policy. And of course, we want to highlight that because the work of movements is often so invisible. but it's some of the most important on-the-ground work for advancing feminist economic and ecological justice. So hopefully we've done at least some justice to amplifying that work. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope I was within time. I actually have no idea. Um, and I appreciate having the space to introduce this work. I'm really excited to hear from the panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope you read the report. We've got a really cool version of the website this year. Did you share that, Katie? I can't remember. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I appreciate it. And I'm excited to pass it over to the panel. Thank you. Katie, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Arimbi. In case you couldn't tell, that was like 6 months of work, and a really comprehensive, both kind of scoping job and then also putting it together in a way that is clear. So we're so grateful to work with Arimbi on this report, and thank you for the presentation. I just put the website in the chat with a caveat that it is a little bit of a soft launch. The report has been online since last night. So when you go to the website, you'll see the English, Spanish, and French. Arabic is coming by the end of today, hopefully. And if anyone wants to read the report in Arabic, in the meantime, and you can't wait, I'm happy to send you the undesigned version. And you'll also notice on the website in Spanish and French, the charts are not yet translated, but those are coming within a few days as well. So thanks for your patience. But as Arimbi said, excuse me, it is a really nice interactive format on the website. And we'll also be sharing some communications products. We'll do a sort of roundup of the charts and the data so that you have it in different formats, so that hopefully it can be useful to your advocacy. So thank you again, Arimbi. Before we get to our panel, we have a little bit of time for clarifying questions, or if there's something you want to know more about that Arimbi went over, please feel free to either use the raise hand function or put your question in the chat. We'd be very happy to answer if you want more information about the report or what's in it. To Ritu's question, yes, we are going to have PDFs in 4 languages, English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. That should be on the website by the end of the week. And when everything's ready, we'll send out a big email so that you have everything in one place, including the slides, because I saw a request for the slides, and then also a recording of, excuse me, of Arimbi's portion of the presentation. Just one other thing to note, when you joined, you probably got a notification that the meeting's being recorded. We are recording for note-taking purposes, but from here on out, we won't be publishing the recording. So please feel free to speak freely. It won't be online anymore. We're just going to put the Arimbi presentation part online. So I meant to mention that at the beginning. Okay, any clarifying questions? We'll have time for real discussion a bit later, but if there's anything anyone wants to know more about or ask Arimbi about, please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat. I see a question from Eunice. Yes. So one of the things that we are hoping to offer with this report is the level of kind of research that Arimbi has done. So each chapter has notes and sources and places you can go to read the full reports that Arimbi is citing. It's very much put together as kind of a piece of gray literature that leads to other sources of evidence. That's exactly what we're trying to do. So thank you for asking that question. And thank you everyone for the compliments in the chat. It's very kind. Aisha, please go ahead.
Hi, Katie. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you to Arimbi for that comprehensive overview. I was wondering, Arimbi, if you could say a little bit more about the implications of the trends that you're noticing around climate finance for the way forward. I mean, how might it impact in future the availability to access to climate finance? I felt like you spoke to that, but I don't know if there's anything else that you can say to what the future will look like in that regard, future climate finance.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Aisha. I think something that we highlight in the report is always the kind of future avenues for some of the important things like climate finance. I think in particular, one of the ones that we highlight for civil society input, or actually, I guess I'll highlight two, one of which is the work program on Article. Oh, yes, perfect. Katie is scrolling down to find it. The work program on Article 9, which while it isn't exactly what we wanted in terms of ensuring the kind of scale up of public grant-based climate finance, because it's not an action plan or a delivery roadmap, as we highlight here, that's one of the pathways to be scaling up public grant-based climate finance. And I think especially kind of taking the focus away from that $1.3 trillion goal that a lot of countries have been talking about at COP, because that's, it's includes so much more beyond public grant-based climate finance, and we really want to focus on how to deliver that 300 billion per year. And then another interesting avenue that links to climate finance is, of course, the UN Tax Convention and advocacy under the UN Tax Convention. So we covered it a bit here, but polluter pays taxes are something that could be within the scope of the UN Tax Convention, but hasn't quite been advanced by a lot of countries. But I will note that after having reviewed a lot of the submissions by countries to the UN Tax Convention, not a lot of countries are talking about how these kinds of taxes, polluter pays taxes, can be used as a source of climate finance. But interestingly, some are. So, for instance, the UK. If anyone's familiar with the UK context, we have, well, they've implemented windfall profits on on the fossil fuel industry, that has just been extended, I think up to 2030. And in the wake of that extension, the UK has also provided a submission to the UN Tax Convention in which they name polluter pays taxes, as being a potentially important mandate. It's not actually in the report here, so thank you for trying to find it there, Katie. But yeah, I think that is interesting that the UK has actually highlighted that. And I think it shows how national implementation of certain kinds of taxes can also move countries towards global advocacy, because we haven't in the past seen the UK advocating for that kind of thing. And it's a bit of a nascent stage, I think, for talking about polluter pays taxes. It looks like no countries are really talking about it in their submissions, but I think that's, potentially an opening. I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arimbi, and thank you, Aisha, for the question and for being willing to go first. Would anyone else like to ask a question or find out more about the report? Thanks, Liz, for adding context to the chat. Mariam, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful. I just wanted to ask if the report covered some context about Germany, because lately, I think last year, we saw, a heavy interest of Germany trying to, invest in African energy projects, based on loans through the African Development Bank. So I was wondering if you were able to capture some context there, and maybe you could share some insights if you have them. Thank you.
I don't think we covered Germany, except maybe, Katie, under the systems bit where we have all the countries that cut development finance. And I do think that's something that would be interesting to highlight more going forward is, when we were talking about how the US has rejected multilateralism and cut development finance, that's an opportunity to also talk about other countries and how they've enabled and done the same. So that kind of insight is really useful, perhaps for the kinds of things we can amplify in the next report. But in this one, no Germany, I believe. And it's not in these charts either, it seems, is it? No, it's not.
No, thanks, Mariam, for pointing to that. There's so much happening and always so much more we could be taking into account, including looking at other multilateral development banks beyond the Bretton Woods institutions. That's definitely a gap and something we can think about for the future. Thanks. We have time for maybe one more question before we move to the panel, if anyone has one. Okay. Well, in that case, let me pull the slides back up, and we're now going to move into some discussion with some amazing colleagues who are going to, as I mentioned, talk us through how they're thinking about the kind of information that's in the report in relation to their own work, and as an offering for all of us as the feminist, economic, and climate justice movements. So I'm going to hand over to Gina Cortez Valderrama, who is moderating this portion. Thank you so much, Gina. And you see on the screen the names of our amazing panelists. I believe Gina will be introducing them. And Faustina, I see your question, and we'll come back to it after the panel. So thank you so much for your patience. And thank you, Gina, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Buen día a todos. And thank you so much, Katie, Arimbi, and all the team that has been behind the elaboration of this report. I think it has been an amazing work and a very critical work in the current geopolitical context that we're living. And even though 2025 was a year of anniversaries, as Arimbi was saying, 30 years of Beijing, 10 years of the SDGs, Paris Agreement, and so on, instead of that being reason for celebration, what we are seeing is that fragility of those commitments and also the institutions where they are embedded. And I think that something that this report is also showing us is that even though we often speak of a broken system, actually what we are seeing is that the systems are very well working to the way that they were designed, upholding that imperialist power dynamics. They were designed for that, and they are working perfectly well. So this report, more or beyond of being a very fruitful reading, it has to be part of that political act, of a clear action to shift that story of historical plunder and punishment that has exploited the South for so many decades, so many centuries. So with that, I would like to invite our fellow panelists to open their camera. I will be introducing them while we are talking. The idea is to have a conversation today reflecting on that. And I would like to start with Tara Povey. Tara, you are a joint coordinator for the Gender Equality and Macroeconomics Project at the Bretton Woods Project. And your work has focused on the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, and also understanding, how austerity and neoliberalism in different countries, particularly in the Middle East and in North Africa, has been affected by these different policies. And also your recent research on how the IMF policies are still operating show us that they continue with this line of structural adjustments. So in line with the Trends Report and also with the Rabat Declaration, where we call for a structural reform, or even with the full replacement of such an institutions, and you work with civil society, where do you see the possibilities for change? And where do you think that we need to be honest, more honest about the limits of reform when seeing that Critical Trends Report? Over to you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Gina, and thank you to Arimbi and Katie and everybody who worked on this wonderful report. It's extremely impressive to read all of the areas that you have put together and in this kind of analysis as well. Yes, it's a really important question that you ask, especially at this particular moment, Gina. As you said, in the research project that we recently undertook, and I work for the Bretton Woods Project, which is a civil society watchdog focusing on the IMF and the World Bank, and I look particularly at the IMF. We wanted to really look at, what the IMF policy was and has been kind of over a longish period of time, because recently the IMF has been making all sorts of noises about how it's really concerned about inequality and gender and climate, and previous to this year, where it seems to have kind of capitulated to the US administration, it had all sorts of strategies around these things and staff working on these areas. So yeah, we really wanted to see like what has the policy actually been. So we looked at 14 years of IMF policy in surveillance reports, and surveillance is kind of one of the main areas that the IMF does. Every country has this kind of surveillance Article 4 report written about them. It should be once every year. And the important thing to say about surveillance is that, because it's not to do with lending, which is the other thing, obviously, as you say, that the IMF is known for, that it lends to countries with conditionalities attached, which are obviously often kind of extreme forms of neoliberal policy that are very, very harmful and damaging. Surveillance is not even, that bad as as lending, if you like. But when we looked at surveillance, we found that, as pointed out in the report, that really it's, massive amount of fiscal austerity. So 99% of the reports over that time recommended fiscal austerity, 96% recommended public sector wage cuts. And then, of course, the other really high number was that 78% of the reports recommended that there was a empowering of the business sector and the external sector, and that countries should go and look for FDI, foreign direct investment, to pay for critical services, basically. And so that combination of policies, so to degrade the state, to degrade the public sector, to privatize everything, and to empower the business class, is structural adjustment. That's classic, textbook structural adjustment. And so that was a kind of main finding. And I think this speaks to your question about, the possibilities and limitations for reforms within these institutions, because obviously structural adjustment, if we look at it at a kind of, you can look at it at a policy level, but you can also, thank you so much, Gina. You can also kind of look at it at the systemic level and how closely it's actually connected to ensuring the dominance of global north capital, connected to dollar supremacy, connected to deindustrializing the global south. And obviously, as a project, it's also really closely, these things are, forms of structural violence that are very much also dependent on militarism as well. So the two things, go together. And in terms of, what we then do about that, I think it's very, very important that we look at it in a way, as Walden Bello has argued recently, which is to use a mix of negotiation, promoting a radical counter agenda, and also coercion, so mobilization. And I think really historically, only mobilization has kind of shifted the IMF and the World Bank and threatened them. So, while bearing in mind that we can negotiate as best we can demand that the institutions do no harm and try to hold them to account. I think, we are at a moment where, we can also push for both a complete alternative to those very destructive systems, and also try to build and mobilize. And hopefully some of the things that research that we produce is helpful for that.
Thank you so much, Tara. I think that from what you said, for me, it would be that, or when you were talking, for me, what was generating was rather more this impulse to set on fire the Bretton Woods institutions, in the sense of how no, seeing that research of 14 years and that continuity on how the money is being mobilized, and also depending on these military industry, how it is depending on all the different punishment that we have seen to the south. It is also that questions about the reforms, or where, as activists and advocates, we also need to start bringing and concretizing our different efforts. I think that that also connects with one of the landscapes that the report is showing us, and it's in Argentina. Argentina has been a country as well that recently, as it was shown, has been having new agreements with the IMF. No, and I would like to call you, Julia. Thanks for joining us. You are a member of the research team of FARN, and you have a trajectory working on issues on environmental justice, public policy, and also sustainable development in Argentina. What we are seeing right now is actually how the country is a very particular version, no, like a laboratory of everything that the report is describing: the debt conditionality, the austerity, the rollback of environmental and also gender protections. So when we see all of these, and also coming with the reflections that Tara was telling us, do you see that a reform of these institutions feel realistic where you are standing, or where does the change have to come? Does it have to come somewhere else, or how do you see it? Over to
Bueno, muchas gracias, Gina. Primero que nada, agradecerles. Es un placer enorme estar en este panel con grandes compañeras, con Gina, Tara, con todas. Aprendo mucho de ustedes. Y bueno, también especiales gracias a Katie y Arambi por el trabajo titánico que están teniendo. Y la pregunta, como mencionó Gina, hoy Argentina está viviendo una versión extrema y muy clara de todo lo que de lo que cuenta Tara, de lo que vemos en el informe. Diría que somos algo así como un laboratorio de ajuste bajo un gobierno de extrema derecha. Es muy triste. Somos el principal deudor del Fondo Monetario desde el 2018, y esa relación no solo define nuestra política económica, sino que hoy en la Argentina define qué es políticamente posible y qué queda directamente afuera del debate democrático, ¿no? En este contexto, déjame decir que la pregunta sobre la reforma de las instituciones de Bretton Woods en particular, y el Fondo por la relación con Argentina, es incómoda pero necesaria. Como mencionó Tara, en los últimos años ha habido avances parciales, más lenguaje sobre género, clima, nuevos instrumentos, muchas veces no, encubiertos bajo soluciones que terminan siendo falsas soluciones, pero aún así había un poder de tracción, ¿no? Yo creo que 2025 y 2026 marcan un punto claro de inflexión peligroso en términos de retroceso de derechos y en términos de las agendas feministas de género eh, y climáticas. Ante ese retroceso, a mí me parece, y una puja, ¿no? Por el aumento del gasto militar, una puja preponderante de capital privado, ¿no? Para financiarizar soluciones tecnocráticas, ¿no? Y bajo una presión mayor del gobierno de Estados Unidos y del gobierno de Estados Unidos y otros gobiernos de derecha a nivel mundial, las instituciones de Bretton Woods están claramente replegando sus compromisos en género y clima. Esto, por ejemplo, se traduce en que el FMI funcionó, los equipos especialistas, entre comillas, que trabajaban en género y clima, y eso no es anecdótico, ¿no? Es una decisión política de dónde se abocan los recursos y dónde va los recursos, de dónde van los recursos, ¿no? No para el desarrollo, no para género, no para clima, sí para un aumento del gasto militar, sí para el financiamiento de partidos de derecha a nivel global. Entonces, eso en Argentina resulta clarísimo, se siente con brutalidad. El préstamo aprobado recientemente, el salvataje dado por el gobierno, por el FMI, apoyado, respaldado, ¿no? Por el gobierno de Estados Unidos, básicamente refuerza un programa de austeridad, desregulación y extractivismo, mientras que se desmantelan en el país áreas claves como el Ministerio de Mujeres, Género y Diversidad, como todas las políticas públicas. Entonces, cuando hablamos, a mí siempre me gusta decir que cuando hablamos de ajuste fiscal y cuando hablamos de autoridad, eh, eso tiene una correlación, es tangible, ¿no? Y un ejemplo muy claro justamente es ahora, porque todos esos millones de dólares no van al desarrollo, ¿no? Sino que, por ejemplo, en Argentina, la financiación de políticas de manejo de fuego llevó a que hoy, en enero, febrero, se hayan quemado más de 45.000 hectáreas en la Patagonia Argentina, mientras los recortes a las políticas públicas de prevención y combates del fuego fueron brutales y apoyados por el FMI. Entonces, cuando hablamos de ajuste fiscal, estamos hablando de esto. Entonces, es realista un poco, me parece, pensar la reforma desde adentro, o sea, que ellos vengan con reformas nuevas, y me parece que no alcanza. La historia de los 80, de los 90, lo mostró con claridad, ¿no? Particularmente en Latinoamérica. Cambia el lenguaje, ¿no? Pero la lógica disciplinaria en nuestros países del sur global permanece. Hoy ya no lo llamamos como los 80, 90 ajuste estructural, pero sí hablamos de anclas fiscales, de reforma de subsidios, de liberalización energética, expansión del extractivismo. Obviamente, esto no quiere decir abandonar la disputa institucional, ¿no? Y continuar presionando, sino significa no depositar todas las expectativas ahí. Y ahí coincido mucho con lo que mencionó Tara, que el cambio real tiene que venir desde afuera hacia adentro, ¿no? De la presión sostenida, creo que es lo que genera más ruido, ¿no? La presión sostenida de los movimientos sociales, feministas, climáticos, de la articulación sur-sur, ¿no? Y de la construcción de una legitimidad política, una alternativa de poder diferente, para decir que este modelo de endeudamiento, sometimiento y desarrollo está agotado. Entonces, eh, creo que como parte del movimiento ambiental feminista sabemos algo clave, y es que los sistemas no se van a transformar, o sea, no se van a transformar solos, ¿no? Solo porque reconozca el problema. Entonces ahí creo que está nuestra tarea de seguir empujando y de seguir, ¿no? Recordando que justamente, como mencionamos y como a lo largo de toda esta conversación, que la deuda, ajuste, extractivismo no son fallas del sistema, sino son el sistema mismo, ¿no? Y que cualquier transición justa va a requerir de disputar ese poder de una manera mucho más profunda. Entonces creo que en el caso de las instituciones, particularmente de Bretton Woods, siempre que se han generado cambios ha sido justamente por la presión, de una gran presión y movilización social desde afuera y no desde adentro, porque son bastante reactivos y bastante tibios, digamos, ¿no? A la hora de querer trabajar estos temas. Así que justo veo el tiempo, así que bueno,
Okay.
espero no haberme extendido.
Mm,
Gracias, Gina.
Muchas gracias a ti, Julia. Thank you so much. I need to switch. Thank you so much. And I think that something that you have mentioned and that I find particularly interesting is how it has been demonstrated that this disciplinary logic, if I am translating that well, no, this disciplinary logic is still part of and will continue to be part of that. Those institutions is, I would say, not only the disciplinary, but is that imperialist logic that is so embedded in different institutions. And this question is not only to be reflected in the face of what are we going to do with the Bretton Woods institutions, but also there are also larger questions and reflections happening currently, such as, for example, with the UN, the United Nations reform. No, we are seeing in the current context, we are seeing that it is happening a situation where we see a moment where Palestine, Venezuela, Iran, among many others, are being bombed with the same complicity, either if it's active or if it's passive, of the same governments that are showing up to that multilateral tables to take some decisions and to also speak on behalf of different pueblos, communities, and so on. So this question is also a larger question, no? A UN system that in their decision-making processes and even in the same notion of who is human, no, and can deserve those guarantees is still, let's say, under discussion. So I would like to invite Ibrahim El Hatimi. You're a research fellow from MENAFem Movement for Economic Development and Ecological Justice, and you have been working on the intersections of gender, climate justice, food sovereignty, and environmental policies in the Swana region. And I would like as well to link with what we discussed and also what came up after our Rabat gathering in the Rabat Declaration. It is named directly, and also the Trends Report is restating it, no? That we cannot separate economic justice from the liberation struggles. And when we think about systems transformation, what does that mean? So when we talk about reforming the multilateral institutions, no, in engaging in the UN and shoring up multilateralism, what does that even mean for the Swana region right now in the context of those exposed trends? And what does that mean for us, no, as advocates and activists engaging in those spaces? Thank you so much, Ibrahim.
شكرا جزيلا لجميع الحاضرين، تحية طيبة لكم. في البداية يعني يشرفني أن أكون اليوم معكم ممثلا عن حركة MENAFem للمساهمة في هذه النقاشات المهمة، خصوصا في اتجاه التقرير الاتجاهات السنوية وقضايا العدالة الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والبيئية، خصوصا يعني في منطقتنا شمال إفريقيا وسوانا عموما. أشكر المنظمين على هذه الفرصة. طبعا يعني بالنسبة لنا التقرير ليس فقط هو يعني وثيقة تحليلية بقدر ما هو أداة سياسية وتنظيمية، لأنه في نهاية المطاف يساعدنا على تسمية ما تعيشه مجتمعاتنا منذ عقود. أزمة الديون، تقشف الهشاشة الاجتماعية والعنف البيئي هي في الحقيقة ليست أزمات منفصلة بقدر ما هي تعبيرات مترابطة عن نظام اقتصادي عالمي قائم على الاستخراج والتبعية وإعادة إنتاج اللامساواة الاجتماعية. في الحقيقة ما يفتحه التقرير بالنسبة لنا ليس فقط معرفة، يعني التقرير بالنسبة لنا لا يشكل فقط معرفة معينة، بل هو يشكل مستوى من الشرعية السياسية، لأن المجتمعات التي نعمل معها سواء كانت حركات اجتماعية أو نقابات أو منظمات نسوية أو مجتمعات محلية تدرك بالفعل أن هناك خللا بنيويا، هناك إدراك فعلي بهذا الخلل. لكن من خلال هذا التقرير يمكن في الحقيقة توفير إطار يعني تحليلي يسمح بربط التجارب اليومية الملموسة، مثلا مثل ارتفاع الأسعار الغذاء وتراجع الخدمات العمومية وتفاقم البطالة وتدمير النظم البيئية بشكل ملموس. في المغرب وفي المنطقة عموما نستخدم هذا النوع من التحليل لتفكيك الخطاب السائد أولا، الذي يقدم يعني الديون كضرورة، يعني يقدم الديون كضرورة تقنية، بينما هي في الواقع أداة سياسية لإعادة تشكيل أولويات الدول. على سبيل المثال مثلا عندما تظهر أن خدمة الديون تستهلك جزءا كبيرا من الميزانيات العامة أكثر مما يخصص للصحة والتعليم، فإننا لا نتحدث فقط عن أرقام، بل نفتح نقاشا سياسيا حول من يحدد أولويات الاقتصاد ولمصلحة من يتم ذلك. كما يسمح لنا يعني تقرير الاتجاهات السنوية سنة 2025 بتقوية العمل التنظيمي على المستوى المحلي من خلال ربط النضالات اليومية بالبنية العالمية التي تنتج هذه الأزمات. بمعنى آخر، هذا الربط هو أساسي لأنه يسمح بالانتقال من ردود الفعل المعزولة إلى بناء وعي جماعي بأن هذه السياسات ليست أزمات هي محلية يعني مرتبطة ببلداننا فقط، بل هي نتاج لنظام عالمي يعني يتحكم في ذلك. بالنسبة لنا التنظيم انطلاقا من هذا التحليل يعني 3 أمور أساسية. أولا، إنتاج وعي سياسي مشترك يساعد المجتمعات على فهم أن ما تواجهه ليست نتيجة فشل محلي، بل هي نتيجة علاقات عالمية. ثانيا، بناء تحالفات بين الحركات الاجتماعية والنسوية والبيئية والحركات العدالة الاقتصادية، لأن هذه القضايا في نهاية المطاف هي قضايا مرتبطة. وثالثا، استخدام هذا التحليل كأداة للمناصرة ليس فقط أيضا للمطالبة بإصلاحات تقنية، بل لفتح نقاش أوسع حول الحاجة إلى نماذج اقتصادية بديلة قائمة على العدالة الاجتماعية والسيادة وكرامة الشعوب. باختصار شديد، ما يفتحه التقرير بالنسبة لنا هو إمكانية الانتقال من توصيف الأزمات إلى تنظيم القدرة الجماعية لمواجهتها. أود أيضا أبدأ بملاحظة أساسية، هو أن الحديث عن إصلاح الأمم المتحدة وتعزيز تعددية الأطراف في هذه اللحظة الزمنية بالضبط يواجه في الحقيقة يعني تناقضا صارخا، لأننا نرى اليوم فلسطين وفنزويلا وأماكن أخرى يعني في العالم تتعرض للانتهاكات يعني بشكل مباشر، أحيانا بمشاركة نشطة وأحيانا بمشاركة صامتة من نفس الحكومات التي تظهر في هذه الفضاءات لتتحدث عن حقوق الإنسان وعن الجندر والمناخ إلى آخره. هذا التناقض في الحقيقة هو ليس تناقضا يعني عرضيا، بل هو يعكس جوهر ميزان القوى العالمي. يعني المؤسسات الدولية ليست خارجة عن السلطة، بل هي جزء منها، أدوارها محددة وفق مصالح الدول الكبرى وليست وفق مصالح الشعوب وخصوصا شعوب الجنوب العالمي. في علاقة يعني إعلان الرباط يؤكد على نقطة مهمة جدا، هو أنها لا يمكن فصل العدالة الاقتصادية عن نضال التحرر. هذه أولا، يعني كل أزمة اقتصادية، كل دين، كل مشروع غير مستدام بيئيا مرتبط بشكل مباشر بالهيمنة الجيوسياسية والنظام المالي العالمي. وفقا لهذا المنظور، فإننا عندما نتحدث عن إصلاح الأمم المتحدة أو عن تعزيز تعددية الأطراف، يجب أن نفهم أولا أن هذه الإصلاحات تحدث داخل بنية محددة مسبقا تعيد إنتاج نفس الاختلالات يعني التي يفترض أنها يجب أن تصلحها. لذلك من وجهة نظر يعني منطقتنا، أي إصلاح يجب أن يقاس بمدى قدرته على تحدي هذه الديناميات مجتمعة. يعني هل نقصد مجرد زيادة تمثيلنا في هذه المساحات، يعني علامة استفهام، أم تغيير قواعد اللعبة نفسها؟ يعني هل نريد أن نجلس على الطاولة أم نريد يعني نعيد تعريف من يملك هذه الطاولة؟ يعني أصلا الاستراتيجية بالنسبة لنا يجب أن تكون في الحقيقة هي مزدوجة. أولا، الانخراط داخل المؤسسات بهدف فتح مساحات للتأثير لطرح قضايا الجنوب بشكل مباشر ولمساءلة السياسات الدولية التي تحدد شروط الاقتصاد والتمويل في منطقتنا عموما. ثانيا، تعزيز التنظيم خارج هذه المؤسسات، هذا أمر مهم جدا جدا، سواء على المستوى الوطني الإقليمي أو عبر تحالفات جنوب. هذه الآليات في الحقيقة هي تخلق ضغطا حقيقيا يدفع لإعادة هيكلة السياسات ويمنع أن يكون حضورنا مجرد مشاركة رمزية أو تسويغ لسياسات يعني هيمنة هي بالفعل قائمة وموجودة. ومن المهم أن نربط هذه العدالة المناخية بالعدالة الاجتماعية طبعا. يعني فكل دين جديد، كل استثمار في الوقود الأحفوري، كل سياسة تقشفية ليست قرارات، بل هي أدوات لإعادة إنتاج الهشاشة. وغالبا ما تكون النساء والفئات الأكثر تهميشا هي من تتحمل الكلفة الأكبر. لذلك بالنسبة لنا تعددية الأطراف ليست أداة للتحرر في حد ذاتها، يعني لكنها ساحة صراع سياسي. نجاحنا يعتمد بالأساس على قدرتنا على التحرك داخل هذه الفضاءات بوعي تام بالقيود وعلى خلق ضغط موازي خارجها، بحيث يصبح الانخراط وسيلة للتأثير وليس وسيلة للاحتواء. خلاصة القول، الانخراط في الأمم المتحدة أو أي مؤسسة متعددة الأطراف يجب أن يكون جزءا من استراتيجية شاملة هدفها النهائي ليس مجرد تحسين التمثيل، بل بناء عالم أكثر عدالة يعترف بسيادة الشعوب ويربط السياسات الاقتصادية بالاحتياجات الحقيقية للمجتمعات وليس فقط بالمصالح الدول الكبرى. شكرا جزيلا على هذه، واعتذر إن كانت هناك
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And when you were speaking about like the representation and what entails in the process of reforming these sort of institutions and saying, okay, who is there? You made me think as well about the group that is conforming, for example, these beyond GDP metrics that has been called by the Secretary General. And when you see there, you would also see that the World Bank is part of that group that is thinking about the beyond GDP no, like initiative and thought. So it's okay, how a representation really there's matter, and also which are the results that we are also going to be having in those type of processes, when we see as well that in the foundations of what a new trend can be, we are still seeing the hand of imperialism there. So this is also a call, okay, how can then we start acting outside and inside? Where as well do we put? I think that it's a period of time that is calling our tactics, our strategies, no, to think about where to put our advocacy work, where to put as well our efforts. And I think that, and thanks already, Ibrahim, for sharing already how you will be using this advocacy tool, and also encouraging us to see this report as a political tool, as an organizational tool. And while you were talking, you were also calling this need not to think about connecting that daily struggle with the international struggle. And I think that in that sense, it is important for us to think, what does that mean in this globalized world where we see that power that comes from the north towards the south? And I think that we need to have as well, and we had that conversations as well in Rabat, to have honest conversations on what does it means concretely, particular in that north-south solidarity, to go beyond rhetoric. So I would like to call Jessica Mandanda. You are a senior policy specialist on women's economic justice at ActionAid UK, and you have also been leading the Feminist Wellbeing Economist portfolio and also supporting the Young Urban Women Project. I don't know if Jessica is with us.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you. I didn't see you in the spotlight. Super. Jessica, and you work in ActionAid. ActionAid also works across many contexts in the global south. No, it is also based in different countries in the global north. And I think that in this question about solidarity, in this question about how where do we see those possibilities, the real possibilities for South-South solidarity and for concrete North-South solidarity? I think that your expertise as well into feminist economic alternatives, and also thinking about the linkages between neoliberalism, colonialism, and patriarchy are very important to understand and to navigate better. What does that mean in real life? What is the call as well that we need to be doing to northern organizations, particularly going beyond rhetoric? So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gina. Can I please just request that while I speak, I switch off my video because the bandwidth, and I don't want you to lose me along the way. Right, so thanks so much again, Gina, and thanks so much, everyone. I think I would echo everything that's already been said by the previous speakers, as well as what's been recommended in the report. In particular, the really importance of acknowledging that what we're experiencing right now is not as a result of just one system failure. It is as a result of a combined system failure. And so we're seeing how colonialism, neoliberalism, patriarchy all worked together to create a very oppressive environment, especially for women and girls. And a lot of our work within ActionAid, whether it comes to advocacy or policy or research, focuses primarily on ensuring that the experiences of the women and girls is accounted for. And that's what we lean on in terms of the narratives, but also in terms of how we then come up with the alternatives and recommendations to mobilize to push back. again, echoing what has already been said, the overall stance is quite similar to what's been shared, is that right now what we need is a complete overhaul and dismantling of the Bretton Woods institutions and the systems of power that have prioritized the global North governments over the global South. And this report, I think that the findings and the recommendations and also the 7 specific thematic areas further affirms the work that ActionAid has done through the research and the findings, and emphasizes the need for us to ensure that we are approaching this work and the analysis from a decolonial and feminist lens, because again, what we're seeing now is not new. And we cannot also continue to just say that these are simply consequences of years of system failure, but a consolidation of that. And I want to also highlight in particular 2 reports that we've done previously, which is the first one on the human cost of public sector cuts in Africa, which covers Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Malawi, and Nigeria, and the Feminist Wellbeing Economies report that also case studies Malawi. And in both of these reports, we are highlighting how over the last 5 years, and even beyond that, austerity measures have led to the deterioration of public health and education services, among other gender-responsive public services that are critical to the survival and the well-being of the people. And all of these reports are also revealing that, the decline in the quality and availability of services has stretched frontline health workers and teachers. And we're also seeing how, a priority, as already been mentioned, a priority has been placed on paying back debt as opposed to the provision of the services. And for those of us who work within the human rights space, we also know that as per the commitments and the agreements that many of our countries have made, it is mandated that each government provide for the affordability and availability of these same services. And now we're finding ourselves looking at an acceleration and a violent rollback on those hard-earned and won human rights and women's rights, as well as the commitments and the agreements that came after it. We should be very clear that yes, we're experiencing a lot of instability, but again, this is as a result and is a consolidation of years and years and years and years of oppressive systems that have been implemented by these institutions. And within that consolidation, we're also seeing it as the success of a patriarchal imperial economic order and how it is protecting itself through these rollbacks. I think when it comes to your specific questions and the points around South-to-South solidarity, the first point I would like to make, it would be around debt and fiscal sovereignty, where we have global South governments increasingly being aligned in calling for a UN Framework Convention on Debt, a UN Tax Convention, and the push to shift decision making away from the IMF and the World Bank. And like Tara said, that can only be done if we're mobilizing together. At local level, we need to mobilize to push our governments in order for them to come together and push back on these systems, while we're also mobilizing as civil society. South-to-South solidarity must also move from diplomatic alignment to coordinated political pressure, which I think Ibrahim also spoke about, which could look like, refusing austerity conditionalities collectively. And I know there's some countries that have pushed back on certain conditionalities from the IMF and the World Bank, but we need to see more of that, and we need to see the coordination across the countries. And now more than ever is the opportunity that we have been presented with some of the examples being given from countries such as Burkina Faso and how they're working together with other countries within their region as well. We also need to look at, South-to-South movement building and synthesizing with the understanding that we are working to dismantle and overhaul a system that has set out for many years to erase our identities and to lessen our existences. Alongside our systems of governance, alongside our economies and functionality, and has violently coerced us to participate in a system that continues to extract from us today. The second point would be around public systems as feminist infrastructure. As I shared from our the Human Cost of Public Sector Cuts report, which has shown again that austerity has collapsed the gender responsive public services that are essential for well-being and human survival. It is very important that we also come to an acknowledgement and understanding and a shift in our language to say that this is simply not mismanagement. It has been a policy choice that has been imposed on the Global South government. So South to South solidarity needs to center on rebuilding public systems, not as social spending, but as feminist economic alternatives that prioritize well-being and survival through the implementation of gender-responsive public services and progressive taxations. And those are just two recommendations to start with. And the third point would be around protection of civic space. As we've seen, and especially last year, where unfortunately some of the key spaces that we participate in as, human rights activists and movements and organizations who also focus on economic justice, a lot of the convenings that we, provide the opportunity for us to convene happened to be in the US, and we know what's happening with the US. And even before then, some of the spaces were just not as accessible. And it is very, very important for us to also acknowledge that the inaccessibility itself is another part of the consequences of the system failure. It is very deliberate. It has been a buildup. And if we're to go into like an in-depth analysis, we can also see that right when civil society and our collectives were coming together to really build a collective mass to push back, and we're building traction and we're making so much noise, is when the accessibility was removed. And it's very important for us to notice what those trends have been, right? And so one of, South-South solidarity needs to come from a point of understanding that this happened. And that doesn't mean that we don't mobilize. It simply means that we need to find other ways to mobilize and come together with that understanding. And we need to build cross-regional protection mechanisms and rapid response funds and a sense of political defense for activists, right? And that leads to the fourth point, which is, again, as Tara said, historically, these institutions respond to mobilization. And if we are coordinated and organized and we continue to build that mass, we can push back. Similar to how governments, in the Global South and globally, they also respond to mobilization. And I'll give an example for Malawi. A few years ago when we came together as a country, understanding that the result of the election was not what we intended and what we did not vote for. We mobilized and protested for about a year until, the courts overturned that election result. And so we need to continue coming together to mobilize and come together. And I know I am out of time, so I'll take like a few last seconds to also speak on the North to South solidarity. And I'm taking a deep breath here because it's a very tricky one, right? Because we know what the impact has been, and we know how the Global South has been viewed and has been treated by the Global North. And so North to South solidarity can go beyond rhetoric in a few ways, right? The first one is for Global North governments to stop blocking Global South proposals. If Global North governments say they support gender equality and climate justice, which of course they do in many, 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 many documents, they need to stop obstructing negotiations on debt and tax at the UN as a start. They need to confront militarism at home. And they need to shift power, not just funding. And that speaks a lot to the conversations that are happening around reparative justice, which is beyond just signing a check and saying, oh, here, we caused so much damage to you, and so here's some money to make up for it. It is beyond just funding. And we can also see that the basic understanding of Global North governments in terms of what solidarity needs to look like and what reparations need to look like has to do with money. And we're seeing how they're pushing back on ODA as well. It's beyond that. it is understanding that even the simplest and slightest move that benefits the global north over the global south itself is injustice. I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Gina, and I'll hand back over.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It has been amazing how you have navigate us through how this report is of use of many of organizations such as ActionAid, but also these calls for solidarity and many things to say. I think that in terms of that South-South solidarity, indeed is what we need to see, looking how different governments, how different groups start acting on that, their sovereignty, and start building up those blocks that are going to say, fuck you, US, we're not going to continue paying these. We're just going to stop on this. But for that, you need to continue leveraging power. And I think when it comes to the North, the solidarity and tangible, while you were talking, for me, the word that was coming was disobedience. I was connecting it with the context of Germany, in which you have to apply, even as the UN, you have to apply for doing a manifestation, and you cannot do it, for instance, in this and this time schedules, for example, when there is a football match, because you're going to block the ways of people going to the football match. And it's like, come on, people, like, exactly in that moment is where you have to burn the city, like in that moment is where you have to block, because it has to be uncomfortable. It has to get into the daily life of the people to ask themselves, what the fuck is going on, and why is this blocking, and why do we need to shift our attention to the comfort of our heating and sofas to see what is happening outside and to take that action. And I think that disobedience is so important, and it's so critical. The same disobedience that we have seen in the South, when we are confronting our governments when they take us the minimum guarantees for the minimum salary, right? I think that it is part of what is, and it's not how the North is going to instrumentalize our fights, but it's how they learn, how they look for that, and also start acting in more radical ways in the urgency that is needed so much in this moment. How we leave that, or the North leaves that sofa of condescendence and start acting on these different calls that our colleagues are doing. And I would like to pass it before we close to Julia and Tara as well, to reflect a little bit on how, from your organizations, how from your work you foresee using this report, what in your organizations, how important this is also going to be for continuing that activism and that advocacy work. I will give it first to Tara, and then we continue with Julia. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gina, and thanks to the other speakers as well. Just to say, I think one of the huge strengths of the report and coming out of the Rabat Declaration as well is to make the connections at the systemic level, because as you very rightly say, the system is not broken. This is how it's intended to function. And so it's functioning very well for the corporations and those who benefit from the continued extractivism and the neoliberal policies as well. And I think that the other real strength of it is the connection between militarism and the kind of global economic policies as well, because historically we can see that this form of extractivism, the intensity of the structural violence, cannot be maintained except through militarism. That's historically how it has functioned, and it continues to function like that as well. And so really, again, trying to kind of make the links between these different areas, and to, even when we are looking again at the Bretton Woods institutions, we can see, for example, that the last since the 1970s, this moment of crisis now that we are in has its origins in the 1970s, when you have dollar supremacy. The dollar becomes a reserve currency of the world. You have the petrodollars, the fossil fuels, and the intensification of of militarism in that period and beyond as well, resource wars. And of course, you know, there are the Bretton Woods institutions. The IMF has been at the center of maintaining, for example, dollar supremacy and debt and those kind of things as well. Just last week, so can go on about this, but just last week they had a huge press conference in which the IMF was saying that, well, you know, the problem in Venezuela is that their external debt is too high. It's 180% of the GDP. And that's, you know, they're signaling to the creditors that if Venezuela is granted the SDRs, that is vital to alleviate the huge economic crisis within the country, that can be, you know, sent to the creditors, and that the, you know, oil money can go to the private companies, given that it's already been now privatized. So, you know, it's the IMF that kind of is at the center of many of these things. So making those links, I think, is something that we'll just continue to do in our work. So thanks very much for everybody who has worked on this.
Thank you so much, Tara. Julia?
Creo que ya mis compañeros y compañeras han dicho la mayoría, pero creo que como parte también de mi trabajo cotidiano y bueno, y de nuestra realidad en Argentina, creo que este informe es una caja de herramienta política. No solo funciona como un diagnóstico y algo que surgió mucho en la conversación, desbloquea algo clave, ¿no? Poner en palabras simples, en palabras comunes, procesos que muchos de los países del sur global venimos atravesando. Y lo que empezamos a ver en cada charla, en cada debate, en cada reunión es que nos encontramos con los mismos problemas y bueno, ya es un espacio en donde construir solidaridad, construir redes y justamente, de nuevo, retomo un poco mi punto de la intervención anterior, justamente poder hablar de que estas políticas financieras internacionales y que estas instituciones no suene tan lejano, tan abstracto, sino que moldean justamente nuestra vida cotidiana, nuestras escenas de desarrollo. O sea, los problemas que nos enfrentamos no son realidades aisladas justamente y son parte del mismo sistema. Una repetición, fue muy clara, Tara, una repetición de recetas, una receta de austeridad continuamente para cualquier problema, bueno, austeridad. A su vez también creo que nos permite de algún modo retomar, ¿no es cierto?, traducir decisiones que se toman directamente en los pasillos, en los directorios de estas instituciones, en espacios, en impactos muy concretos de la vida cotidiana de las mujeres, de la expansión del extractivismo y el retroceso en derechos. Y esto no funciona, que es un tema que también sale mucho, sin represión y restricción al espacio cívico. Y esto sí me parece muy importante hacer hincapié, principalmente en Argentina. Todos los programas de ajuste que se han llevado a cabo no funcionan sin represión, ¿no? Desde hace 2 años estamos experimentando un deterioro significativo, feroz, al acceso a la libertad de expresión, ¿no es cierto?, al derecho a manifestarse, en donde en cada manifestación, en cada encuentro de activistas, movimientos sociales, sindicatos, etcétera, termina habiendo una represión feroz por parte del gobierno. Entonces, justamente estos programas de ajuste austeridad no funcionan sin ese componente. Y bueno, y creo que para cerrar, me parece que este informe y este tipo de espacios nos da legitimidad política, nos empieza ya desde la declaración de Rabat, nos ayuda a construir un lenguaje común para decir algo muy simple, pero que a su vez es fundamental, ¿no es cierto? Que no hay justicia económica sin justicia climática y que ninguna de estas dos esferas pueden ser realizables sin justicia de género, sin la mirada feminista y sin los aportes de los más vulnerables y desventajados del sistema. Así que bueno, eso por mi parte. Muchas gracias y fue un placer.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you so much for all my fellow panelists. I think it has been a great discussion, what we have to date. And I think that what we can also take from the conversation is how this report is a clear call to fight imperialism, right? I think it's a call as well on reflecting deeper on how the different fights that we're having in the economic justice sector, in the climate justice area, in gender justice, in racial justice are coming to be threaded or to be woven in this same fabric, in the same boiling pot that is, let's say, placed under that imperialist capitalism, neoliberalist system that is plundering the world. And I think that this report is a great political tool, as many of you said, to convey and to come together in what is the work that we need to be doing in the South. I think that it is also important to differentiate, or not differentiate, but also like to consider the fact that in the South, we have a lot of work to do in shaping as well those blocks that are going to say no to austerity, that are going to say no to debt, that are going to shift as well their labor regimes, that are going to strengthen as well their public services. And on the other side, we have as well that call, those numbers, those figures, those examples to feed the fire of the North, for them to disobey those norms that are so constructed under the racist, ableist, patriarchal system, that are so much interconnected with the same military system, with the same elite, with the same corporate system that is historically drawing the rules of how this system has been working. And I think that this is a very valuable report. And I think that is great as well to see how many South feminists thinkers have been behind as well this report, have been as well these gatherings, have been as well these reflections. And I think that it's also a call for us to start as well breaking or unlearning so much of the many things that we have learned in schools, in our university, in our masters, in all these different, also part of the colonial and capitalist system, education systems, and how we unlearn so many things and start as well reading our feminists from the South, reading as well other forms of advocacy, of artist expressions, of other ways of coming together, because I think it's also part of how this epistemic and how our knowledge system have been built, that also is going to be reflected in how we behave, how we interact, and how we also expand our imagination to construct other trends that are actually enabling us to shift the system. So with that, I will pass it over to Katie. Thank you so much for keeping connected. And yeah, back to you, Katie.
Thank you so very much, Gina, and our incredible panel, Julia, Ibrahim, Jessica, Tara. It was really, really exactly what I was hoping for in terms of making the report real, situating it in the context of our work, and of your analysis, which shaped the report. So, thank you. Thank you so much.